The morning sun barely touched the streets of downtown Memphis when Marcus Johnson stepped out of his small grocery store to grab the newspaper. He had owned Johnson's Corner Market for 15 years, opening it every morning at 6 sharp. The 52-year-old man wiped his hands on his apron and breathed in the cool morning air. Everything seemed normal that Tuesday morning in October. Marcus had built his life around routine. Wake up at 5, shower, eat breakfast with his wife Sarah, and walk the 3 blocks to his store. His customers knew they could count on him. The elderly Mrs. Rodriguez would come for her morning coffee and pastry. Young mothers would stop by for milk and diapers. Construction workers grabbed sandwiches for lunch. Marcus knew everyone by name, and they knew him. That morning started like any other. He unlocked the store, turned on the lights, and began preparing for the day. The coffee machine gurgled to life, filling the small space with its familiar aroma. Marcus arranged the newspapers on the counter and checked the cash register. Everything was in its place. Around 7:30, his first regular customer walked in. Mrs. Rodriguez shuffled through the door with her walker, smiling warmly. Marcus already had her coffee ready, just the way she liked it. 2 sugars, a splash of cream. They chatted about her grandchildren while she counted out exact change from her worn purse. The morning rush began around 8. People hurried in for quick purchases before work. Marcus moved efficiently behind the counter, ringing up items and making conversation. He noticed a young man enter the store, someone he had never seen before. The stranger wore a dark hoodie despite the mild weather, hands tucked deep in his pockets. Marcus felt a slight unease but pushed it aside. New customers came in all the time. The hooded figure wandered through the aisles, seemingly browsing. Other customers continued their shopping, unaware of Marcus's growing discomfort. Something about the way the young man moved seemed off. His shoulders were tense, and he kept glancing toward the door. The store gradually emptied as people left for work. Soon, only Marcus and the stranger remained. The young man approached the counter slowly, his face partially hidden by the hood. Marcus could see he was barely out of his teens, maybe 20 at most. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his jaw clenched tightly. Marcus smiled and asked if he could help find anything. The young man's hand emerged from his pocket, and Marcus's blood ran cold. A small silver pistol pointed directly at him. Time seemed to freeze. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The coffee machine dripped steadily. Marcus's heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. The young man's hand shook violently. His voice cracked when he spoke, demanding all the money from the register. Marcus had always wondered what he would do in this situation. He had imagined being brave, maybe even fighting back. But, now, staring down the barrel of a gun, his mind went blank. His hands moved automatically to the cash register. As Marcus opened the drawer, he noticed something that made him pause. The young man's eyes were filled with tears. This wasn't the hardened criminal Marcus had pictured during those what-if scenarios. This was a desperate kid who looked as terrified as Marcus felt. Marcus pulled out the bill slowly, his movements deliberate and calm despite his racing pulse. He had about $300 in small bills from the morning sales. Not much, but enough to make this go away. He placed the money on the counter and stepped back, hands raised. The young man snatched the bills with his free hand, shoving them into his pocket. But he didn't run. He stood there, gun still raised, breathing heavily. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His whole body trembled like a leaf in the wind. Marcus found his voice, though it came out steadier than he felt. He told the young man to take the money and go. No one needed to get hurt. The store had insurance. It was just money. But the stranger didn't move. If anything, his shaking intensified. Then, something unexpected happened. The young man's shoulders began to heave. A sob escaped his lips. The gun wavered in his grip as tears streamed down his face. He looked like a child who had gotten in over his head, not a dangerous criminal. Marcus watched this breakdown with a mixture of fear and something else. Compassion, maybe. He had raised 2 sons of his own. He knew what a young man in crisis looked like. Against every instinct screaming at him to stay back, Marcus took a small step forward. The gun snapped back up, steadier now. The young man shouted at Marcus to stay where he was. His voice was high and panicked. Marcus froze, hands still raised. They stood there in a tense standoff, neither quite sure what would happen next. The bell above the door chimed, shattering the moment. Both men turned to see Tommy Chen, a regular customer and off-duty police officer, walk in for his usual energy drink. Tommy's trained eyes took in the scene instantly. His hand moved toward his hip where his service weapon rested. Everything happened fast after that. The young man swung the gun toward Tommy. Marcus shouted a warning. Tommy dove behind a shelf, drawing his weapon. The young man backed toward the counter, swinging the pistol wildly between Tommy and Marcus. Marcus could see the situation spiraling out of control. Someone was going to get shot. Maybe all of them. His mind raced for a solution, but before he could act, the young man made a decision that stunned everyone. He pressed the barrel of the gun against his own temple. The store fell silent except for the humming refrigerators. Tommy crouched behind the shelf, weapon drawn but not aimed. Marcus stood frozen behind the counter. The young man's finger rested on the trigger, his whole body shaking violently. Marcus had seen desperation before. He had grown up in a rough neighborhood, watched friends and family struggle with poverty and addiction. But he had never seen anything like this. A kid so lost, so hopeless, that he would rather die than face the consequences of a petty robbery. Without thinking, Marcus spoke. His voice was soft, gentle, like he was talking to one of his own sons. He asked the young man his name. The question seemed to surprise everyone, including the person who asked it. The gun stayed pressed against the young man's head, but his eyes flicked to Marcus. After a long moment, he answered. His name was Devin. Devin Mitchell. He was 19 years old. The words came out between ragged breaths and suppressed sobs. Marcus kept talking, his voice calm and steady. He asked Devin about his family. Did he have parents? Siblings? Someone who cared about him? Devin's responses came slowly, pulled out like splinters. His mom was sick. Cancer. He had a little sister, only 12. His father had left years ago. As Devin talked, his grip on the gun loosened slightly. The barrel drifted away from his temple, though he kept it raised. Marcus sensed an opening. He told Devin about his own sons, how they had made mistakes growing up. Everyone made mistakes. It didn't have to end like this. Tommy remained hidden but alert, waiting for an opportunity. Marcus could see him in his peripheral vision, ready to act if needed. But Marcus hoped it wouldn't come to that. He kept Devin talking, asking about his mother's illness, his sister's school, anything to maintain the connection. Devin's story spilled out in fragments. His mother had been diagnosed 6 months ago. The medical bills piled up fast. He had dropped out of community college to work, but minimum wage jobs couldn't cover chemotherapy. They were about to lose their apartment. His sister would have to change schools, leave her friends. The desperation in Devin's voice was raw and real. Marcus understood now. This wasn't about drugs or gang initiation or any of the usual reasons kids turn to crime. This was a young man watching his family fall apart and feeling powerless to stop it. Marcus made a decision that would change both their lives. He told Devin to put the gun down. Not for the police, not to avoid jail, but so they could talk. Really talk. Marcus had connections in the community. Maybe he could help. But first, Devin had to put the gun down. Devin's hand shook harder. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone in that small store. 3 lives hung in the balance, waiting for a 19-year-old kid to decide their fate. Finally, slowly, Devin lowered the gun. His arm fell to his side like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The weapon clattered to the floor. Devon collapsed to his knees, sobbing openly. The danger had passed, but the real story was just beginning. Tommy emerged from behind the shelf, weapon still drawn but pointed at the ground. He kicked Devon's gun away and called for backup on his radio. Marcus came around the counter, moving slowly, and knelt beside the broken young man. What happened next would ripple through the community in ways no one could have predicted. A moment of crisis had become a turning point, not just for Devon and Marcus, but for everyone their story would touch. The gun was on the ground, but the most important choices were yet to be made. The police arrived within minutes, their sirens cutting through the morning calm. Devon sat on the floor of the store, handcuffed but no longer struggling. His tears had dried, leaving tracks on his face. Marcus stood nearby, refusing to leave even when the officers suggested he might want to step outside. Officer Tommy Chin gave his statement to the responding officers. The situation was clear-cut. Armed robbery, weapon recovered, suspect in custody. It should have been simple. But Marcus Johnson had other ideas. As the officers prepared to take Devon away, Marcus spoke up. He wanted to talk to the detective in charge. The officers exchanged glances but agreed. Detective Patricia Williams arrived shortly after, a veteran cop who had worked the neighborhood for 20 years. She knew Marcus well. He had helped solve several cases by providing information from his customers. Marcus pulled Detective Williams aside. He explained what he had learned about Devon's situation. The sick mother, the medical bills, the desperate attempt to save his family. Williams listened patiently but reminded Marcus that circumstances didn't erase crimes. Devon had pointed a gun at people. He had committed armed robbery. But Marcus persisted. He asked if there was any way to help the kid. Williams said Devon would need a good lawyer, but even then, armed robbery carried serious time. The system didn't have much flexibility for cases like this. As they talked, Sarah Johnson arrived at the store. Marcus's wife had heard about the incident from a neighbor and rushed over. She found her husband safe and immediately broke down in tears of relief. After hearing the full story, including Marcus's desire to help Devon, she surprised everyone by supporting her husband. The Johnsons had always believed in second chances. Their own eldest son had gotten into trouble as a teenager, saved only by a judge who saw potential instead of just another statistic. They knew firsthand how one person's compassion could redirect a life. Devon was taken to the county jail for processing. His mother, Angela Mitchell, was notified. Despite her weakened state from chemotherapy, she came to the jail immediately. The meeting between mother and son was heartbreaking. Angela blamed herself for putting so much pressure on her son. Devon blamed himself for adding to her burdens. Meanwhile, Marcus couldn't get Devon's story out of his head. That evening, he called a family meeting. His sons, Michael and David, now grown with families of their own, came over for dinner. Marcus told them everything that had happened, including his strange desire to help the young man who had threatened his life. Michael, a lawyer himself, was skeptical. He reminded his father that Devon had made a choice. Plenty of people faced hardship without turning to crime. But David, who worked as a social worker, understood their father's impulse. He had seen how poverty and desperation could drive good people to terrible decisions. The family debated late into the night. Sarah finally asked the question that mattered most. What would they want someone to do if it was one of their sons? The room fell silent. They all knew the answer. The next morning, Marcus did something that shocked the community. He went to the jail to visit Devon. The young man could barely look at him, ashamed of what he had done. Marcus sat across from him in the visiting room, separated by thick glass, and made an offer that left Devon speechless. Marcus would not only refuse to press charges, but he would speak on Devon's behalf in court. More than that, he would offer Devon a job at the store once this was resolved. The pay wouldn't be much, but it would be honest work. Marcus would also help connect Angela with resources for cancer patients who couldn't afford treatment. Devon broke down completely. No one had ever shown him this kind of mercy. He tried to refuse, saying he didn't deserve it. Marcus disagreed. Everyone deserved a second chance, but not everyone got one. This was Devon's. Word of Marcus's decision spread quickly through the neighborhood. Reactions were mixed. Some praised his compassion and Christianity. Others called him naive, even dangerous. What message did it send to let armed robbers off easy? The local news picked up the story, and soon Marcus was fielding calls from reporters. At Devon's arraignment, Michael Johnson surprised everyone by showing up as his defense attorney. He had decided to take the case pro bono after long discussions with his father. The prosecutor, faced with an uncooperative victim and strong community support for leniency, offered a plea deal that included probation and community service instead of jail time. But the story didn't end in the courtroom. True to his word, Marcus hired Devon as soon as he was legally able to work. The first few weeks were awkward. Customers who knew what had happened watched Devon suspiciously. Some refused to be served by him. Others made pointed comments about security. Devon endured it all with quiet dignity. He arrived early, worked hard, and never complained. Slowly, Marcus taught him not just how to run a register, but how to run a business. He introduced Devon to suppliers, showed him how to balance books, and explained the importance of knowing your customers. Angela Mitchell's health remained precarious, but the resources Marcus connected her with made a difference. A local church took up a collection for her medical bills. A cancer support group provided emotional support and practical assistance. Devon's younger sister, Jasmine, was able to stay in her school thanks to emergency assistance from a community fund. 3 months after the incident, something remarkable happened. Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly customer who came in every morning, handed Devon a birthday card. She had somehow learned it was his 20th birthday. Inside was a $5 bill and a note that said, "For the young man who was learning to make better choices." Devon had to excuse himself to the back room to compose himself. When he returned, several other regular customers had small gifts or cards. The community that had initially rejected him was beginning to accept him. Not because they had forgotten what he did, but because they could see who he was becoming. Marcus watched this transformation with satisfaction. But he knew the real test was yet to come. Devon had been sober throughout this period, throwing himself into work and family responsibilities. But the pressures that had driven him to desperation hadn't disappeared. His mother's cancer had spread. The bills kept coming. Life remained hard. One evening, as they closed the store together, Devon asked Marcus a question that had clearly been weighing on him. Why had Marcus helped him? He could have let Devon go to prison. No one would have blamed him. Marcus's life would have been simpler. Marcus thought for a long moment before answering. He told Devon about his childhood, growing up in poverty similar to Devon's. He talked about the people who had helped him along the way. A teacher who stayed after school to tutor him. A shop owner who gave him his first job. A community that invested in his future even when he couldn't see it himself. None of those people had to help him. They could have written him off as just another kid from the hood. But they didn't. They saw potential where others saw problems. They invested in hope rather than surrendering to fear. Now it was Marcus's turn to do the same. Devon listened intently, understanding dawning in his eyes. This wasn't just about him. It was about breaking cycles, about creating the world we wanted to live in, one choice at a time. Marcus hadn't just saved Devon from prison. He had invited him into a legacy of community and compassion. As they locked up the store, Marcus made another unexpected announcement. He had been thinking about retirement in a few years. His sons had their own careers and weren't interested in taking over the store. But maybe, if Devon continued on his current path, there might be an opportunity for him to buy into the business. Devon stopped in his tracks, stunned. From armed robber to potential business owner in a matter of months? It seemed impossible. Marcus reminded him that nothing was guaranteed. There would be years of hard work ahead, lots to learn, trust to be earned and maintained. But the possibility was there. They parted ways that night with a handshake and a shared understanding. The road ahead wouldn't be easy for either of them. There would be those who never forgot or forgave what Devon had done. There would be moments when Devon himself would struggle with shame and self-doubt. But there would also be mornings when the sun touched the streets of Memphis just right, and Devon would open the store he once tried to rob, serving coffee to customers who would become friends. There would be moments when he could send money home to help with his mother's treatment, earned honestly through hard work. The community watched and waited to see what would happen next. Some expected Devon to fail, to revert to crime when things got tough. Others believed in the power of second chances and the transformative effect of unconditional compassion. Time would tell who was right. 5 years passed like pages turning in a book, each day writing a new line in an unlikely story. Devon Mitchell stood behind the counter of Johnson's Corner Market, but now he wore a different expression than the desperate young man who had once entered with a gun. His eyes held wisdom earned through struggle and redemption. The store had evolved too. Marcus had gradually given Devon more responsibilities, and the younger man had risen to meet each challenge. He had instituted a delivery service for elderly customers who couldn't make it to the store. He had partnered with local schools to provide healthy snacks at cost. The store had become more than just a business. It was a community hub. Angela Mitchell had defied the doctor's predictions. Her cancer hadn't disappeared, but it had gone into remission after a long battle. She attributed her fighting spirit partly to her son's transformation. Watching Devon rebuild his life had given her a reason to fight harder. She now volunteered at the same cancer support group that had helped her, paying forward the kindness she had received. Jasmine Mitchell had graduated high school with honors. Her big brother's journey from desperation to determination had inspired her own academic success. She often worked at the store after school, learning business skills while saving for college. Devon had started a college fund for her with his earnings, determined that she would have the opportunities he had missed. On a crisp autumn morning, almost exactly 5 years after the robbery, Marcus Johnson called Devon into the small office at the back of the store. Devon found not just Marcus waiting, but also Sarah, their sons Michael and David, and Detective Patricia Williams, who had stayed in touch over the years. Marcus announced his retirement. At 67, he was ready to spend more time with his grandchildren and travel with Sarah. But he wasn't going to sell the store to strangers. Instead, he offered Devon a partnership opportunity with favorable terms that would allow him to gradually buy ownership. Devon's journey from gunman to business owner seemed like something out of a movie, but the people in that room had witnessed every difficult step. They had seen him work 16-hour days during his mother's worst periods. They had watched him train new employees with patience, often hiring people who, like him, needed second chances. Detective Williams spoke up, sharing something she had never told Devon. In her 20 years on the force, she had arrested hundreds of young men like him. Most ended up in the system permanently. But Devon's story had changed how she approached her work. She now spent more time connecting troubled youth with resources before they turned to crime. Michael Johnson added that Devon's case had inspired him to take on more pro bono work for young offenders. He had successfully helped a dozen other young people avoid prison by advocating for alternative sentences focused on rehabilitation and restitution. The signing of the partnership papers was emotional. Marcus handed Devon the keys to the store with hands that shook slightly. These weren't just keys to a building. They were keys to a future that had once seemed impossible. Devon accepted them with the gravity of someone who understood their true weight. The community response to the news was overwhelmingly positive. The same customers who had once watched Devon with suspicion now congratulated him warmly. Mrs. Rodriguez, now 93 and still coming in for her morning coffee, joked that she had always known he would amount to something. But Devon's story inspired more than just warm feelings. Other business owners in the neighborhood began reaching out to Marcus and Devon, asking how they could implement similar programs. A network formed, creating job opportunities for young people coming out of difficult circumstances. The local news covered the 5-year anniversary story. The reporter who had first covered the robbery returned to document the transformation. The segment went viral, not because it was sensational, but because it offered hope in a world that often seemed short on second chances. Letters poured in from across the country. Parents of troubled teens asked for advice. Former inmates shared their own struggles to rebuild. Business owners wanted to know how to create similar opportunities. Devon found himself thrust into a role he never expected, a symbol of redemption and the power of community investment. He struggled with the attention at first. Who was he to give advice? He had made terrible choices and was only where he was because of Marcus's incomprehensible mercy. But Sarah Johnson reminded him that his story wasn't just about Marcus's compassion. It was also about Devon's choice to accept help and work for change. A year into the partnership, Devon instituted a program he called Second Chance Fridays. Once a month, the store would interview people with criminal records for entry-level positions. Not everyone worked out, but those who did often became the most dedicated employees. They understood what it meant to be given an opportunity when the world had written them off. One of those employees was a young woman named Keisha who had been arrested for shoplifting baby formula. Like Devon, she had been desperate, trying to feed her child while fleeing an abusive relationship. Devon hired her as a cashier, and, within 2 years, she had become an assistant manager. Her story added another layer to the store's growing reputation as a place of transformation. Marcus, though officially retired, still came by the store most mornings. He and Devon would share coffee and discuss business, but their conversations often turned to deeper matters. They talked about forgiveness, about the responsibility that comes with second chances, about how individual actions could ripple out to change communities. During one such conversation, Devon revealed something he had never told anyone. On that desperate morning 5 years ago, when he had pressed the gun to his own head, he had fully intended to pull the trigger. The weight of his failures, the shame of what he had become, had seemed unbearable. But Marcus's voice, calm and compassionate, had pulled him back from the edge. Marcus listened with tears in his eyes. He admitted his own secret from that day. When he saw Devon's desperation, he had seen his own son Michael, who had once stood on a similar precipice as a teenager. The memory of almost losing his child had driven Marcus's seemingly irrational compassion. He couldn't save every troubled young person, but he could save the one in front of him. As Devon's business skills grew, so did his vision for the store. He partnered with local farmers to bring fresh produce to the food desert their neighborhood had become. He worked with healthcare providers to host monthly health screenings in the parking lot. The store became a model for how small businesses could address community needs beyond simple commerce. Politicians and policymakers began visiting, wanting to understand how this transformation had occurred. They came expecting to find a program they could replicate, a system they could implement. Instead, they found something more complex and more simple: human connection, persistent compassion, and the revolutionary idea that people could change. Devon always told them the same thing. Programs didn't save him. Policies didn't transform him. A person did. A person who chose to see possibility where others saw threat, who invested in hope when fear would have been easier. Systems and structures could help, but ultimately, change happened in the space between two people choosing to believe in each other. 10 years after that fateful morning, Johnson's Corner Market hosted a community celebration. The small store could barely contain the crowd that gathered. Former employees who had gone on to better jobs returned to pay respects. Customers whose lives had been touched by the store's unique approach brought their families. Angela Mitchell, cancer-free for 3 years, spoke about watching her son transform from a desperate boy to a community leader. Jasmine, now a social worker herself, talked about how her brother's journey had inspired her career choice. Detective Williams, now retired, shared stories of the young people she had helped redirect before they made Devon's mistake. But the most powerful moment came when Devon spoke. He didn't minimize what he had done 10 years ago. He owned his choices and their potential consequences. But he also spoke about the power of intervention at crucial moments, about how Marcus Johnson had literally saved his life twice, once from prison and once from himself. He announced that the store would be launching a non-profit foundation focused on providing emergency assistance to families in crisis, the kind of help that might prevent someone from making desperate choices. The foundation would be named after Marcus Johnson, ensuring that his legacy of compassion would continue long after both men were gone. Marcus, now 72, stood with his wife Sarah as the crowd applauded. He thought about the split-second decision he had made a decade ago to see a human being instead of just a threat. That choice had redirected not just Devon's life, but countless others. It had proven that individual actions, guided by compassion and wisdom, could create ripples of change that transformed entire communities. As the celebration continued into the evening, Devon stood outside the store, looking at the business he now owned. The same streetlights illuminated the same pavement where he had once walked in desperation. But everything had changed. The store was no longer just a place to buy groceries. It was a testament to the possibility of redemption, a beacon of hope in a neighborhood that had seen too much hopelessness. A young man approached, but pulled up despite the warm evening. Devon tensed for just a moment before recognizing the look in the kid's eyes. Not criminal intent, but the same desperation he had once carried. The young man asked if it was true that the store hired people with records. Devon smiled and invited him inside. As he poured 2 cups of coffee, he prepared to share his story again, to extend the same ladder that had been extended to him. The cycle of compassion continued, one choice at a time, one person at a time, building a better world through the revolutionary act of believing people could change. The gun that had once pressed against Devon's head had long since been destroyed, but what had grown from that moment of crisis could never be destroyed. It lived in every second chance given, every job offered to someone others had written off, every young person who chose hope over desperation because they had seen what was possible. Marcus and Devon stood together in the store as the celebration wound down, 2 men from different generations bound by a moment of crisis that had become a lifetime of purpose. They didn't need to say anything. Their shared work spoke louder than words. In a world quick to punish and slow to forgive, they had created a small space where transformation was possible, where the distance between a gun and a grocery store could be traveled with the right guide. The story that had begun with a desperate young man pressing a gun to his head had become something neither man could have imagined. It had become proof that in our darkest moments, when all seems lost, the intervention of one person who chooses compassion over fear can change everything. And, sometimes, just sometimes, that change can ripple out to transform not just one life, but an entire community.